NASUS, the low elo terror that farm stacks and split pushes to win, is rarely ever seen in high elo. That is until I found this player, named Desperate NASUS. And this guy managed to play NASUS in mid lane all the way to rank 1, 1282 LP, hitting Challenger in both EU West and EU Northeast, becoming the highest ranked NASUS in the world, and all of this in a new lane, even going for a very similar build to top lane NASUS, still scaling into a late game monster. He has a new laning strategy to ensure he can survive the bad mid lane matchups, often not even getting many stacks, which is bizarre on NASUS. He told me his secrets to solo killing challenger enemies on this immobile pick, and even a new update for patch 13.10 that makes this pick even better. This is probably the highest level of meta player we've ever covered, and he gave me all of the tips and the tiny details that turned him from a gold player into literally a rank 1 player on his server, with this rare champion. But first, as some of you may know, in February I got a new laptop, the Alienware X15R2, a 15-inch super portable, super powerful gaming laptop, and I've been using it for 4 months now and I can't recommend it enough. I'm happy to say they're sponsoring this video, so let me tell you why this laptop is so amazing. Here are the specs of the one I chose, perfect for everything I use it for editing, recording and playing any game, but you can go all the way up to 12th gen i9, top of the line graphics and even 8 terabytes of storage. It's insane. But my favourite and the most special part is the screen. This is a 360Hz screen, the highest refresh rate I've seen in my whole life, and it's so smooth to play games on. It's a whole different experience to playing 60Hz. If you haven't upgraded yet, you're definitely missing out. I have to admit, I do play League of Legends on this, and on this laptop it runs perfectly on full settings, so I never miss anything in a fight. But it also handles AAA games that actually look good with ease. Also having a full speed performance mode where it cranks up the performance to make it even smoother in exchange for more power usage. Having this good of a laptop lets me work anywhere on any project. It's so freeing to be able to get out of your room and still have the tools to do anything. The quad fans are super quiet, it's hard to even hear them, and of course, as it's Alienware, you have their amazing customer support, so if anything goes wrong, you have them there to fix it. I've used laptops in the past, but nothing anywhere near as good as this one that can actually fully replace a desktop PC for gaming and work. So to get your own X15R2, check out the link in the description to see all of the options for different budgets, and get yours today. Back to Desperate NASUS. His story, probably unsurprisingly, started with the legend of Trick2G, loving his playstyle and wanting to replicate it, even though at the time he was only in gold. The next season our player made a fresh account, wanting to play NASUS only, and his goal was to get to diamond. This is where our player stumbled across another legend, Carnarius. At the time he was the best NASUS player in EU, so our player watched all of his videos and streams trying to copy what he was doing in top lane. It was so great for him to have this role model to improve his own gameplay, and very quickly he hit diamond, and then he just kept going, master and then grandmaster, amazed by how much he could improve by focusing on one thing. Once reaching grandmaster, he began to have some issues. The players he was facing in such a high rank were of course incredibly good, and they knew all of the problems that NASUS top lane has, so our player began to lose and lose. Eventually he'd had enough of being dived top lane and denied stacks, so he decided if he wanted to hit challenger he needed to swap to mid lane, and after this swap to mid he shot right back up to grandmaster and through to challenger, hitting rank 1 in season 13 with this role, and now holding 2 different NASUS challenger accounts to prove that this pick truly works. So what are the reasons he's playing NASUS mid? Well, he told me a lot of people, including his challenger teammates, have said this is a troll idea, but to him there are quite a few reasons this lane is better. First off, this lane is shorter, so reaching minions to get stacks is of course a lot easier. You can't be zoned off the wave, freezing is a lot harder, and even ganking mid lane is harder than top lane. You really have to mess something up to die in this lane, especially since you're a top lane champion that has lots of health and lifesteal to stay alive. Of course there is still one huge risk of mid lane, and that's if your wave gets pushed to the enemy tower and you can't recover it. NASUS is low mobility and can be in a lot of trouble. One really smart trick our player does in lane to manage this is if he's against someone with AoE damage like an Orianna, a Syndra or even a Zed, if your wave is accidentally pushing into them, then he stands inside the wave and actually lets the enemy hit him with their abilities. The reason for this is that they'll also hit the wave at the same time, pushing it back towards you as they're dealing damage, saving him from this potentially much worse situation. And this leads into the second reason he likes mid lane more, the matchups. In top lane, so many champions are built to all in and run you down, going from 100 to 0 in a few seconds. Things like Darius, Riven, Irelia or even Olaf, they're all champions that never run out of damage in a fight. However, mid lane is full of poke and burst champions, things like Syndra, Orianna or even Veigar. They are limited by their mana pools and comboing their abilities together, so against NASUS NASUS, it's just really hard for them to ever poke him down enough to get a kill. On top of this, his passive has lifesteal, and in mid lane this is way more effective as you have so much easier access to the wave than in top. So all throughout laning phase you'll be healing for more than usual, meaning it's harder for these poke champions to poke you down. The third reason for mid lane is very simple. Mid lane is faster to reach than to go to top lane, so if he ever makes a mistake or just has to base, it'll take less time to get back, and this will just mean he'll miss less stacks, and getting more stacks will just make him stronger. But possibly the best advantage is that NASUS is actually able to use his 2v2 and 3v3 power a lot more. NASUS is known as a very weak early game champion that scales to be really strong, but a lot of this is just because he's played top lane, so he never really gets to show off his power. So our player loves to contest even first dragon since he's now so close to it. With this huge W slow and still really good Q damage once he gets Sheen, he can carry early game fights. And if he gets a couple of kills, that's going to snowball very quickly. So let's get into game to see him do this against challenger mid laners. Early game is by far NASUS' most important part of the game. The first 10 minutes decide how well the rest of the game is going to go. Against level 1 threats like Yasuo, Irelia or Akshan, he starts E. In high elo, sure getting stacks are important, but what's way more important is staying alive in lane. He says that even one death in high elo can pretty much end your laning phase or even end the game, so making as few mistakes as possible is his goal, and this means sometimes at level 1 you just can't walk up to the wave. In the easier matchups, for example against poke mages, he can start Q. He's still playing quite slow, but he is picking up farm and getting some stacks, already using the lifesteal passive to regen some poke. Level 2 he takes his other ability, either Q or E, and already against poke matchups he's kind of safe. He has Doran Shield and the Q lifesteal, so enemies like this Cassiopeia just can't poke you enough to get you out of lane without them running out of mana, so mid NASUS can already absorb most of their pressure. In almost every matchup he is going to be pushed into tower, so he needs to practice CSing under tower a lot, always keeping in his mind that it's never worth being poked out of lane just to get a few stacks. Unfortunately, our NASUS player says he can only afford to have one focus, himself. It may sound a bit like ego, but really you just can't afford to think of others when you're playing this pick. If your jungler gets invaded or the enemy mid is roaming, then your job stays the same. You can't afford to match them or run around the map chasing them, as your champion won't be able to compete. Instead, his job is to stay in mid lane, getting all of the XP and the gold, as well as taking any plates he can. If the enemy mid ganks bot lane, he's still staying mid. Instead of making early plays, his goal is to wait for two things to happen: him buying Sheen and Boots of Lucidity. The best recall he can get is at 1650 gold, buying both of them at the same time. Sheen is really good for the extra Q damage, which also gives you more lifesteal, but since his mechanics are so good, he often goes Lucidity Boots first, as it's really rewarding for the cooldown reduction, and also the movement speed to outposition enemies. One thing I thought was quite interesting was that our player doesn't buy any more mana. Even though it would be very simple to buy a tier and never run out of mana again, it would even make his laning much easier. The problem is that on some champions like NASUS, the gold is so valuable that you can't afford to use it for something like a tier. Even that 400 gold will delay your power spike and make you weaker than the enemies, and they can use that tiny advantage. So this turns his playstyle into a very fine line, making him very careful of how he uses mana. For example, never using E on just a couple of minions, as if he does this a few times he'd already be out of mana. Along with wasted gold, wasting time is just as bad for NASUS in high elo. As a stacking champion, losing time means you're losing stacks. Even just the marginally bad base timing can be a big mistake on this champion. For example, basing to regen your mana and just buy a longsword. This would lead to you losing around 3 or 4 minions, and when you add on the stacks, these are pretty much the same value as the item you just purchased, making the base a waste of time. These are the kind of tiny decisions he had to make to get to rank 1. For summoners, our player takes Ghost Flash. The Flash is great for safety if he's ever ganked, but both of them are really more for getting solo kills. He says it's especially important to not just AFK farm. Even the stats you gain from getting Q stacks and CS won't stop you from falling behind in solo queue due to the pace of the game. Just because you're NASUS doesn't mean you can't take fights early on. Sometimes even challenger enemies become overconfident because you're a NASUS and you're supposed to be weak. Especially against mages, once he gets level 6, he can slow them with W, pop ult and ghost, and then run at them to get the kill. Ideally, he wants to bait out their disengage ability first to ensure they can't escape. Now, in low elo, stacks on NASUS are the #1 priority. They make or break the champion. So I asked him, is it the same in high elo? Does he care about stacks for winning games? He said that each game is going to be different. In some games, the stacks are easy to get, and you'll generate a ton of free AD, and you can use that to win the game. However, in high elo, stacks still do not guarantee success. He's had many games where he gets over 800 stacks, and simply can't do anything, as enemies know how to counter his champion. The main goal of stacking in high elo is using this damage to win lane. If you can build up a lot of stacks quickly, then you can use that damage to either solo kill the enemy mid, or forcefully take their tower, and once you do this you create a huge advantage for your team. So every time he's judging whether to get a stack or not, he asks himself, will this stack help me win my lane, or will it make my lane harder? For example, if he takes a lot of damage to get it, or runs out of mana. Here are his average gold stacks per game, and by matchup. The easier matchups are champions that try to poke you out of lane but can't quite kill you. The harder matchups are ones with sustained damage that you can't really afford to fight. NASUS Mid is a surprisingly complex fighter according to our player. You're not just walking up and pressing Q on the enemy. Since our player takes lethal tempo, this introduces a lot of tiny new optimizations he can do to make his damage so much higher. This rune allows him to weave in auto attacks between each Q, which is also an auto attack reset. So while the cooldown is coming back up, he keeps auto attacking, also using his E, which again is an auto attack reset to give him even more damage. And from using these extra auto attacks and his Q, he can easily stack up lethal tempo, not only giving him attack speed, but also increasing his attack range. His ultimate also gives him extra attack range, so when you add the two together, it gets up to 275 range, which is a lot more than most melee champions. The longer the range, the more Qs he can use. It's really a unique playstyle. One huge misconception for NASUS according to our player is that NASUS is a late game champion. In high elo especially, he's actually strongest in mid game, so our player even tries to end the game at around 3 items. The way he does this is playing to the champion's strengths. Of course the main one is side laning. Whether your laning went well or if you just went even, you can now easily 1v1 any champion in the side lane, often able to even 1 versus 2 if you get enough stacks. This is the reason NASUS Mid is so good. For team fights, NASUS can do them, but only when his summoner spells are up, or if he's forced into a game-changing fight, like going for Dragon Soul. In team fights, his main goal is to use W on an immobile enemy, or to slow the enemy AD carry's attack speed to ensure they can't carry the fight. He's happy to engage, using Ghost to run in and W to set up a target to start hitting. The W is actually the most important part of NASUS for fights, as it's what sets up your damage and your teammates' damage, so saving it for when an enemy mispositions or engages too far up can lead to some great picks. In teamfights he can also use lethal tempo to output a lot more damage. It's no longer just about hitting Qs, and that's why he can get away with having less stacks than a low elo NASUS. He has more damage output overall, so he isn't reliant on only his Q damage. Late game is still the most fun part of NASUS. However, in high elo it can be quite difficult. Usually you can dominate fights, easily take towers, and even end the game yourself, but in Challenger it really depends on the enemy champions. NASUS can still side lane and split push to win the game alone, but if you're just farming to get another 50 stacks, that's never going to change anything. The best thing you can do late game is to group up with your teammates, waiting for enemies to make a mistake that you can catch with your W. In 13.10 this pick changed quite a bit. Lots of AD items were changed, however most of them were crit related, so NASUS Mid didn't receive any of the nerfs that some of the other classes did. However, one huge win is that Sterak's was buffed, now becoming a great item against 3 or more melee champions or against a CC based team comp. One big thing was Assassins getting a big buff in this patch, but NASUS Mid is pretty good against burst champions, as he can just pop his ultimate, so he isn't too worried. One huge thing for this pick was that Sunderer was buffed and it really benefits mid NASUS. Riot specifically said they don't want it to be a tank counter anymore, so the way they nerfed it actually gave more damage to everyone else and reduced the max HP damage, making it way better in mid lane since there are much fewer tanks in this lane. To rate this pick, NASUS Mid, as our player mentioned, is really good for lower elos. It is better than top lane as it's harder to punish and it scales up faster, so if you're picking this champion and you want to be a huge carry, then make sure you pick it in mid. However, our player does say that in high elo, picking NASUS is more like playing a strategy game and your opponent gets an upper hand every game. He does think it's very hard, but even though he's so pessimistic about NASUS Mid in high elo, he did manage to hit rank 1 with it, so it can't realistically be that bad. I think he just knows how hard it can be, but despite this pick was more than good enough to hit Challenger with, no problem. For his full build, he starts Doran Shield every game, really great against poke mids. He recommends Sheen first into Lucidity Boot second if you're trying this pick for the first time, always going Sunderer first item, then Gargoyle's Stoneplate is a really good item on NASUS next, immediately scaling you into a safer tank while still having good damage. Frozen Heart and now Sterak's are both great additions, finishing the build with some tank items, Dead Man's Plate, Thornmail or Force of Nature. For rune pages he has two options. He has the lethal tempo page, giving him the attack speed and the range extension. This gives him the highest damage overall, but he also has this fleet footwork page, which is much better for a beginner NASUS mid player. It makes your laning just a lot easier as you get regular healing on your auto attacks and your Qs, letting you survive lane a lot more often. If you want more NASUS mid, then Desperate NASUS has a Twitch channel, and I also really recommend Carnarius. He has a ton of NASUS mid content as well. Clearly it was good enough to help this guy get to a challenger level, so maybe it can help you as well. Links to them both below. Thanks so much to them for helping with this video, and please also check out our sponsor Alienware in the description if you're in the market for a new laptop. Thanks so much for watching.